Hi, these are notes from a presentation entitled Pipeline, Pathway, or Ecosystem? Do Our Metaphors Matter?, which was given at the ASEE annual conference in Tampa, Florida in 2019. I'm not distinguished, and I gave up lecture quite a long time ago, so my goal here is to go over a lot of material that I hope is going to start a conversation. A decade ago at ASEE 2009 in Austin, Texas, I went to Billy Von Cohen's distinguished lecture. He talked about his book called Discussion of the Method, Conducting the Engineer's Approach to Problem Solving, which is a takeoff from Descartes' famous work. In this book, Cohen talks about engineering being based on heuristics and making the best change in a situation given constraints rather than more rational positivistic science. This is not a research or a pedagogy, but a philosophy. And before that talk, I never realized that philosophy could inform what we do in engineering education. I'm here today representing the division that has the dubious honor of having the longest name in ASEE, Technological and Engineering Literacy and the Philosophy of Engineering, or TELFE. I want to start off by introducing the interests of the division and hopefully provide an introduction to the conversation that will follow. Despite the overly long name, technological and engineering literacies are important. The meaning of literacy is knowledge of letters. In the context of engineering and technology, I take it to mean awareness of context, place, and a sufficient grounding of underlying concept, which gives someone the ability to continue to learn. It also means humility, the opposite of hubris, which is a cardinal sin of engineers. Look up the legend of Sisyphus to understand how the gods punish hubris. In this framework, it helps to conceive of technological literacy as a form of inquiry and discourse, rather than as a curriculum. This is a good point to lay out the basic framework of the conversation I want to start. The world is in a positive feedback loop because of the increasing rate of technological development. Increasingly, we are experiencing that the world is becoming built and not natural, as most of our history and our culture has assumed. This slide shows one clumsy version of this loop. You can come up with better ones that mean the same thing. If you look at extremes, then there are two possible futures ahead of us that are going to be in tension. The singularity versus Skynet. Remember that the singularity is humans' technological transcendence, while Skynet was the self-aware computer that wiped out humanity in the Terminator movies. More realistically, on a scale of utopia versus dystopia, is the ongoing question of humans' relationship with technology that lies at the heart of technological and engineering literacy. I think that there are two possible futures. One is that technology becomes like magic, and mastery of the domain is in the hands of a very few, while others use it as a consumable good. The other is that there is a more democratic process because people are literate in engineering and technology, and these processes themselves are designed to serve human needs. This latter view has been well expressed by Ivan Illich. These types of debates are becoming increasingly common as we see the potential of artificial intelligence and the rapid advancements being made. This presents a challenge since while engineers are central to this loop, even more central are engineering educators because college is a transformative experience that occurs at a time in life when the brain begins to change and loses some of its plasticity. In other words, college experiences matter. But this is not an engineering problem. We can't devise our way out of moral dilemmas. Let me be clear. The loop here, the positive feedback, the way technology will affect all of us is an issue of justice, and justice matters. Justice, values, morality, all fall in the domain of the other part of TELFE, the philosophy of engineering. Philosophy takes many ideas and seeks to develop a coherent belief system from them. While the term philosophy is often used in a derogatory way in engineering, philosophy matters because these belief systems serve as a basis for how individuals perceive the world and act in the world. It turns out there is a well-developed philosophy of technology, a developing philosophy of engineering, established philosophies of education, but very little work on philosophy of engineering education. Personally, I see such work as in need if we are to have the difficult conversations about values and morals that are deeply embedded in all our work in engineering education, whether we acknowledge them or not. To give you a sense of how philosophies work, let me give you a brief example from education from a field known as curriculum theory. This framework posits there are four major and overlapping belief systems about teaching. The gray clouds here are a very brief summary from Shiro's book on curriculum theory that show the four major beliefs about the aims of education. There are other ways that beliefs in education can be broken out, but these are fairly useful. While I'm talking, go ahead and read over these, then take a minute to reflect on these points of view and see which appeals to your beliefs about why education is important. You may align with more than one, or alternatively align strongly to none, but be opposed to one point of view. These are not single states. It's okay to have more than one belief about the aims of education. While these are simple summaries of complex belief systems, the positions you align with determine what you see as the aims of education and what actions you will likely take in your teaching or administrative work. Let me pause here to let you read this. The quote down at the bottom corresponds to the social efficiency point of view and came from a recent report from the National Academy of Engineering. It takes a very utilitarian view, for example, of the purpose of engineering education. As another example, let's look at how belief systems affect conceptions of truth and views of students. This is another image from Shiro's book that looks at how different belief systems look at knowledge. In philosophy, dealing with truth is a branch known as epistemology, the nature of truth, what constitutes valid knowledge. The stance you take, your beliefs, determine to some extent what you value, what you pay attention to, what you accept as truth, and, when given a choice of actions to take, which path you may follow. For example, the different belief systems have different views of knowledge. The vertical axis on the figure represents why knowledge is valued, either from the source it comes from or the use to which it can be put. The horizontal axis represents the source of knowledge, whether it is objective or subjective. So depending on your beliefs about the aims of education, you may see how students represent truth somewhat differently. Lately, I've been doing a lot of reading into a 20th century philosopher named John McMurray to understand how his philosophies are relevant to engineering education. Some of the points his work addresses are that the tensions that arise between knowing the world and acting in the world are important, that thought arises from the results of action, so our practical philosophies inform how we act in the world and help us determine right from wrong, while our theoretical philosophies determine true from false knowledge. He also thought that thought and action are related through an iterative cycle of action and reflection that occurs between ourselves and the world, including other people. He called this the other, and you can see this in the figure. McMurray proposed the developmental cycle which is shown here. Action leads to thought. You'll either have to read McMurray or a forthcoming book that I have for the full story on that. What is key, however, is that actions lead to representations or mental models. And the representations, schemas, or mental models we hold inform our actions. What we believe to be true impacts on how we see the world and how we act. It is also true that our actions affect others. We can either ignore or acknowledge this fact, but what we do matters regardless. Our acceptance or rejection of our impact on others only influences our own actions. The key point is how we act is affected both by the representations we learn and how we choose to make sense of our experience. Mental models matter. This, of course, has been captured by many others. Jerome Bruner recognized the importance of narrative in understanding things that were too complex for rational thought. Lockoff and Johnson, in their Metaphors book, highlighted the importance of metaphor and language in framing how we think. Roland Barthes, Foucault, and Joseph Campbell discussed the power of stories and myths in shaping society. James Pennebaker and Tim Wilson have shown the powers that self-narratives have in shaping how we approach life and dealing with challenges. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky re-examine rational actors' theories of economics and thinking fast and slow. Another good read is Sedlacek's The Economics of Good and Evil. George Kelly's Personal Construct Psychology describes how our mental models are built and affect our behaviors. In brief, there are a lot of different ways to approach the idea that our actions give rise to internal narratives and mental models which will affect how the world is created. Here, this core idea is approached through philosophy and technological engineering literacy. As academics, we like our ideas, but a strong caution is not to hold too strongly to just one model. McMurray's work provides 3 models of reflection, or what he calls a perception, that offer different lenses: a generalization model, a personal model, and a particularization model. And all 3 are needed if we are to create an engineering education system that is effective, meaningful, and just, or to put it simply, worth living in. Ideas backed by experience lead to mental models and ways of seeing the world. These are, of course, tied together. And when we organize around these ideas, as Harari talks about in the book Sapiens, then they lead to what are called structures. Structures are not buildings or physical infrastructure, but they can include these. Rather, structures are basic interrelationships that strongly influence behaviors. Structures matter more than people. In fact, different people produce similar results when put in the same system because even though they are very different, because how we behave is determined to a large extent by our environment, the rules, the resources, the connections, etc. Now, there are three models that are fairly common in engineering education. Don't take these too literally. They represent broad sets of ideas rather than for theoretical frameworks. But as we've seen, these ideas matter, particularly when they lead to how people construct structures in education. One of these is a pipeline. It's fairly common. You hear about the pipeline a lot. A second is pathways. This is emerging right now and is being used more and more. And the third that we're just starting to see is the ecosystem. Walter Lee had a recent editorial in the Journal of Engineering Education that covered all of these in the context of broadening participation. And I'll be referring to this throughout this conversation. In this talk, I'm going to go over each of these, but I really want to spend time exploring the ecosystem model. The pipeline metaphor or model or framework, and I'm pretty bad with precision in my language, so you'll see these terms be used interchangeably, arose from various sources around the late 1970s and early 1980s. It was perhaps first used in a series of reports from the National Academy of Engineering responding to record numbers of engineering graduates and low numbers of engineering faculty. There were concerns about maintaining the quality of education at this time. Remember that these were the Reagan years in the U.S. and supply-side economics was in vogue. In essence, supply-side economics argues that economic growth should be addressed by increasing the supply of goods and services through reducing regulation and taxes. It stands in opposition to demand-side economics. The adherents of supply-side, now often called voodoo economics, believe that supplying more goods and services at lower prices drives economic prosperity. From this perspective, the National Academy report focused on the importance of the supply of engineers as being necessary for the economy and security of the country. When you dive into the model they use, like everything else, it is really just a set of differential equations. The use of the term pipeline in the context of broadening participation, however, seems to have arisen in a 1983 report by Sue Berryman for the Rockefeller Foundation that was referred to pipelines of underrepresented students. It's actually interesting to note that the series of National Academy reports presented a much more complicated model that seems to have been simplified over time into the linear pipeline model that we most often see today. There's actually a reason for this. So we have a proliferation of pipeline diagrams like this one. This is a good illustration of how an idea can become embedded through a simple mental model from which actionable ideas can be drawn for policy and other decisions and almost take on a life of its own. This is an object lesson in what's going to be a recurring theme throughout this talk. Reality is messy, and to understand it in all its detail requires real time and expertise. We tend to deal with complex realities through narratives or stories, and this isn't wrong. It can be quite effective. Mental models, diagram, plot lines such as the pipeline serve as core elements for a story. Jerome Bruner defined a story as having elements of context, character, plot, place, and a turning point. In the pipeline story, context is U.S. prosperity. The characters are policymakers and educators. The plot is that leaks lead to inefficiencies. The place is inefficient education systems. And the turning point of the story is the bold and swift action to repair the pipeline that we're all going to take. The story goes something like STEM will have a shortage of white, male, U.S. citizen workers, putting the nation at competitive risk. Women and people of color, and more recently international students, are populations of untapped resources. Therefore, STEM needs more women, people of color, and international students to fill these shortages. The supply side focus then becomes about recruiting and retaining these students as resources, particularly each of the leaky points in the pipeline, often in problematic ways. I have to admit that I am more guilty than most people in this room of promoting this model or variations of it due to my time at the National Science Foundation. The next couple of slides, which were not presented at the ASEE talk, go into some of the representations that I used. This picture is a policy story about the need for engineering education. The turning point of this story is the 1.5 million engineers, shown in red, in the workforce. And it really is a simpler and cleaner picture of the ones used in the National Academy of Engineering reports from the 1980s. It's a diagram of the relative population of engineers and non-engineers in the education system and workforce. The question mark symbol represents rates that I could not determine with sufficient accuracy at the time I made this diagram. The apparent disparity between engineers, which are shown in red, exiting and entering graduate school arises from an influx of foreign students and baccalaureate engineers who return from the workforce, primarily to get a master's degree. The letters reference what data was drawn from in order to create this figure. And this is actually in the notes, and you can download those if you want to dive into it in a little bit more detail. Note that in the policy dialogues I was interested in at the time, the key focus is on maintaining or growing that 1.4 or 1.5 million engineers in the workforce. The reason for this is that engineers have a huge economic impact. Engineers play key roles in knowledge and technology intensive or KTI firms. Worldwide, KTI firms contributed 18.2 trillion to global GDP in 2010, 30% of the total. In the United States, the total contribution to GDP was 40% or 3.6 trillion. Over half of the growth in GDP is due to technological innovations. In my more cynical moment, it occurs to me that the support we get in STEM education is because politicians need to show how they have stimulated the local economy to get reelected. Here's another model that I made to show the estimated return on investment from funding engineering education. I'll let you read through. The data comes from Science and Engineering Indicators in Norm Augustine's article on engineering and innovation. The basic story here is to show that we get at least a 5-to-1 return on investment, public and private as well as tuition, in engineering education. Also, every engineer we create grows the economy enough to add one new job for every year that they work. These are just estimates, so be careful with the numbers. Note that these policy arguments are very utilitarian and frame the value of an engineering education in economic terms. The trouble with models like the pipelines and the representations I just showed are that they are descriptive, not predictive, and predictions that arise from them are often flawed and drive supply-side arguments. The reasons for this are that it's hard to count engineering jobs or who is and is not an engineer. There's a lot of debate about the need for STEM graduates, mainly because the skills are in high demand. Note that this means we're doing something right. Similarly, the pipeline model is a one-size-fits-all framework that does not recognize the importance of context. The reality is that student situations are unique, and in the pipeline model, external effects such as economics, access, variations in K-12 system are ignored. Another criticism of the pipeline models is that they are very limited in portraying the complexity of issues and broadening participation. Existing definitions of race and gender often minimize factors such as economic status, geographical region, etc. From a philosophical and human dignity perspective, these models make what I call a soylent green argument. The model treats people like a resource. Finally, the pipeline model defines success as completion of a degree, which introduces issues of linearity. That is, it assumes students move linearly through their education. This is becoming more of an issue as college debt increases and will be discussed later, so it's no longer true that students move through programs linearly. The impact of an accurate model such as the pipeline is it steers attention and resources in less effective directions, for example, retention. These criticisms have been made over time in several works. This slide is an image from the Center for Advancement in Engineering Education's final report. This shows some of the misperceptions around issues of retention in engineering education. What you want to look at here is the net change in engineering all the way on the far left, which is the blue bar. Basically, the reason we seem to have retention issues in engineering programs in college is because not all students know what they want to do. For example, look at the difference between migration between business and engineering. In fact, many students go to college to figure out what they want to do. Because of the rigid prerequisite structure and number of courses in engineering programs, however, unless students matriculated in an engineering degree program, it's very hard for them to transfer into one later. This means that if we don't benefit from the entry of students in the second year like many other degree programs. In other words, if you look at this red bar, the difference between inflow is pretty much the reason we seem to have a migration out. You can think of engineering programs like a reverse roach motel. You can get out, but you can't get in. So much for pipelines. Over time, these criticisms led to the pipeline broadening into a conception of student pathways. It's not clear to me when pathways started to emerge as an alternative to the model of a pipeline, but it seems to be about the mid-2000s. The idea of pathways was codified, however, in a National Academies report that is one of the better ones to read to develop a systemic perspective on STEM education. It is not possible to capture a large report succinctly, but the major takeaways from my perspective are that pipeline models don't capture how most students actually move through STEM degrees. The STEM system is complex, and social and educational justice is a systemic issue. Both of these issues are captured in the bad diagram at the lower right, which captures in a very unscientific way the relationships between issues discussed in the reports. One of the key differences between the pipeline model and the pathways model is rather than leaks, which are considered systemic losses, students can move in and out of the system. Lord, Olin, and Layton have done a lot of work looking at student trajectories using the midfield data set, and the images from a recent Journal of Engineering Education paper are used in this slide. The pathway model seems to have originated with concerns of justice, since it is students of color, first-generation students, and those with fewer family resources that often take the most convoluted pathways. This model is a more up-to-date conception of what happens in college given the demographic shifts in higher education. Pathways capture changes in student situations over time that are often due to factors beyond and besides their academic performance. A pathways framework provides an inherent critique of the assumptions built into pathway models. For example, pathways circumvent many of the beliefs that are built into the pipeline model, which is that an individual student moves successfully through a series of academic challenges or curriculum based on their own ability. Because many of the structures in higher education are built from pipeline metaphors, many policies have built-in assumptions that don't always work well for how students actually obtain a degree. This misalignment between the pathway model and existing structures can make change difficult to implement. For example, look at the figure in the center of the slide from the previous referenced JEE article. Rather than enter as a synchronous cohort, students start in different places, perhaps 2- or 4-year institutions, may take classes at other institutions. In fact, it's estimated about 70% of undergraduates do this, or transfer to different institutions, which is about a third of the students. At most universities, the time to degree is also much longer than the 4-year plans envisioned in the promotional material universities send out. And actually, only a little more than 1 in 5 engineering students graduates in 4 years. These situations have arisen as college attendance has increased along with interest in STEM degrees, drawing in students who don't have the same level of family resources. It turns out that the for-profit sector also plays a role in creating these pathways, particularly in healthcare technology and computer-related degrees. I feel like I need to stress again that we aren't talking about numerical models or theoretical frameworks, but ways of thinking, perceiving, and speaking that will steer our actions in ways we are not always even conscious of. So in the pipeline framework, there are sets of beliefs that align with linear progress, while pathways acknowledge more circuitous routes to a degree. One example of an issue with the linear thinking of pipelines and imposing those views on curricula is that credits don't always transfer. The National Academies report that I referenced earlier estimates this costs about $7 billion a year. Another example is the fact that grants and scholarships don't extend past 4 years in many cases, while engineering degrees usually take 5 years to complete. Also, the culture of STEM is not always accepting of students who follow unusual pathways to a degree. In my experience, this doesn't just apply to students, but to our faculty candidates as well. The result of all mental models and structures colliding with the new reality of students who follow more complex pathways is that convoluted pathways generally result in poorer academic outcomes. There's really no reason for this. The latest idea or mental model of framing engineering education systems is around ecosystems. The idea of ecosystems has been used in other educational areas such as health previously. Walter Lee discussed ecosystems as well in his recent editorial in the Journal of Engineering Education, and the previously cited article by Lord, Layton, Olin, and Camacho looked at student trajectories from an ecosystem perspective. I'm going to go into elements of the ecosystem model in a lot more detail later, so I want to give a brief overview here. In fact, many of the ideas of an ecosystem were discussed in the STEM Pathway report from the National Academies that I talked about earlier, but not described as such. These include belonging as an ontological commitment, being critical to success. As a member of an ecosystem, you can't not belong, but you can not thrive. The idea of thriving gives insights into types of metrics that ecosystems models can provide. Another thing the report talked about was that successful degree programs focus on supporting students through advising and mentoring, clear curricula, connection with outside entities through student research or internships, equity of social interactions, and building a sense of community. All of these can generally be described as embeddedness in multiple forms of connection, which is important in an ecosystem. Connections between programs increase student degree completion. This is particularly in regards to transfer students and credits. And as will be talked about later, the underlying idea in ecosystems is making flow easy. In Lord et al.'s JE paper, they distinguished an ecosystem pathways and pipelines through several ideas and graphical ways to display data. One of the ways they distinguished an ecosystem is that of student agency, that students are able to make choices about how to navigate the ecosystem. They also see the ecosystem as more complete and encompassing than that represented in pipeline or pathway models, but still retain the idea of a student journey through an ecosystem. They've developed metrics of stickiness as enrollment in a discipline and graduation of the discipline as a measure of ecosystem health. They also define migration yield as the number of students a program could attract to how many it does attract. In essence, I think they're trying to get at how supportive the niche in the larger ecosystem is. The paper also looked at the graduation rate of migrators to determine if once attracted, the niche in the larger ecosystem was healthy. Note that thriving and graduation have been equated here, and there needs to be a lot more discussion about health, as we'll get to a little bit later. Lee in his editorial discusses the three models in terms of understanding broadening participation. He frames the ecosystem model or paradigm as both more recent and less value-laden than the pipeline or pathway models, which means it hasn't been subject to the same intensity of critique or scrutiny. This slide contains a table from his editorial, which is going to be an eye chart, but in brief, he's contrasting the models on 9 different factors that might be helpful to engineering education researchers. In his view, the ecosystem perspective is framed as environment-centered, local, focusing on connections and community, and the experience have in an environment as active agents, as well as providing insights and changing policies that affect the lived experience of students in their environment. As Lee points out in his editorial, the use of any metaphor will highlight some aspects of a concept while inherently preventing us from focusing on another. One of the insights is that each perspective, pipeline, pathway, or ecosystem, has something to contribute to the issue of broadening participation. Okay, let's stop for a minute. I think I got a little sidetracked in going over these 3 models and some of the evidence with the result that I drifted away from the main themes of literacy, which is knowledge of elements from which concepts are constructed, and philosophy. Before I dive more deeply into the ecosystem framework, I want to zoom back out and reframe the argument that this talk is making. First, the mental models, modes of apperception, or paradigms we hold fundamentally affect the way we see the world, the actions we take, and collectively not only how the world is, but what the future will be. These mental models go beyond our work in engineering education and impact all aspects of our lives. The models we hold are determined by and help determine how engineering education programs are structured. Structure determines behaviors and places difficult to discern limits on agency. The models we adopt are not important for just engineering education, but also because as the world becomes more technological and built rather than natural, it's going to affect the lives of most people on Earth, as well as other creatures that live on this planet with us. This is a question of justice, as much as it is a question of education. As Carl Mitchum said in a recent article, what Percy Bysshe Shelley said about poets 2 centuries ago applies even more to engineers today. They are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. By designing and constructing new structures, processes, and products, they are influencing how we live as much as any laws enacted by politicians. This places a huge responsibility on engineering educators. The 3 models, pipelines, pathways, and the ecosystem, differ on many factors, as Lee pointed out, but one area I feel that is perhaps the most important is the degree of linearity, with pipelines being the most linear and ecosystems the least. Both pipelines and pathways are structural metaphors. They posit the existence of defined structures through which students move to graduation. Let's look at one example from one of my previous lives. Curriculum is an example of structure which reflects ways of thinking. In this case, it maps a linear and sequential series of courses to take. This is an old curriculum map from an engineering program I was previously associated with. You probably have something similar in your program, and you can find lots of these at most universities. There are other styles of maps for programs that reflect other values. Some examples of these are competencies at Alverno's, the Great Books program at St. John's, the work model of Deep Springs in California. Other programs such as Olin and Iron Range and many of the universities discussed in the Ruth Graham report are beginning to explore other underlying philosophies that are based on connectivity rather than linearity. But structure is more than a curriculum diagram because it is also the whole system of policies embodied in the registrar's office, admissions, etc. To move beyond existing structures and the limitations they provide, we need to update our philosophy and get back to the basics of what we believe and value. This is going to be really hard work because those structures that we rely on for our day-to-day work are deeply embedded. But we also need to realize we work in the domain of engineering and must also look to where engineering is going before we begin to change the structures. A good question to ask is why using an ecosystem framework in engineering education is relevant to engineering beyond maybe producing somewhat better outcomes. So for this, I want to draw from an address the late Chuck Vest gave in addressing the National Academy of Engineering back in 2005. He hit on themes of systems, scale, and complexity as being key to where engineering is going. You can read an excerpt of his talk on this slide. The excerpt also captures themes of discovery and service, which are also key in engineering. What I want to point out are two themes that emerge highlighted in blue. The first is the shifting of traditional boundaries, which the National Science Foundation is now capturing through initiatives on convergence. The second is the importance of complex systems as a frontier of engineering. I argue that it's important to include education in this list of systems of great complexity and importance because it is my belief that the demise of a nation is no less certain if its education system fails than if the power grid goes down, the roads are not maintained, or water becomes in short supply. In fact, the nation's demise may be more certain since the demise of an education system is more of a frog water situation and harder to detect. I want to go back and revisit the philosophy of John McMurray for a second. Remember, this diagram shows a model of how we develop as persons, with a key step being that we can reflect on our experiences in different ways. One of the points I would like to make here is that our system of philosophy needs to expand to include not just elements that allow our actions to be effective, just, and meaningful, but also holistic or complete. In other words, we need to better learn how to understand the entire system and the effects of our actions and perceptions have on others, both humans and non-humans. Part of the perception of systems is also to see how the system in which we are embedded either contributes to or opposes and limits our own and our students' agency. In the framework I'm trying to develop, and I want to insert a shameless plug for a book that I just got out, I argue that our future depends on creating students who are not just effective engineers, but also who work for justice, find their work meaningful, and can understand the complete systemic impacts of their work. Because our students don't only learn from what we teach, but also from the environment they are in and the structures they interact with, then it's worth thinking through what moving to an ecosystem framework could mean. I want to spend the rest of this talk diving deeper into the ecosystem metaphor or paradigm to see if it can provide any insights on providing such education. The word ecosystem is composed of two Greek roots that together mean the place in which we live in which the various parts are interdependent. The idea of an ecosystem goes back to ancient times as teleology, but the concept of an ecosystem wasn't formulated until the 20th century, so it's fairly new. Certainly after the Committee of 10 helped standardize secondary education in the U.S. It's important to recognize that the term ecosystem is itself imprecise because it seems to refer to an object. But an ecosystem is not a thing. It is a web of relationships across scales. Thinking in terms of an ecosystem paradigm requires a shift in thinking away from objects or artifacts, putting it in contrast with the pipeline metaphor. Also key to the ecosystem perspective is that whatever system you talk about is dynamic. As a first approximation, the pipeline and pathway metaphors assume working in a system that is fixed, which allows policies to be developed and applied to relatively fixed systems. There are three elements to the paradigm that are important and highly overlapping, but tend to have been developed separately. The first is complexity. Parts interact with each other in multiple ways, culminating in a higher order of emergence greater than the sum of the parts of the system. The idea of emergence is that new properties can arise that were not envisioned or intended. These properties may, but need not, be beneficial. The second part of an ecosystem is that it's a system. The fact that properties emerge not through standalone designed features, but through interconnection. Donella Meadows defines a system as a set of things interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. System behaviors are determined by the underlying structures of the systems. The third element of an ecosystem is that it's alive or based on life. Ecosystems use biological rather than engineering metaphors. For example, a pipeline is a built system constructed for a purpose with defined entry and end points, capable of being fixed or improved only with human intervention. Living systems to date have arisen spontaneously and through emergence and are not anthropocentric. The remainder of this talk will develop the ecosystem metaphor model in more detail. As with most paradigms, models, or metaphors, they can either be taken to be relatively small perturbations to existing models that allow insights into how the current paradigm does not fully represent reality, or as fundamentally new insights that demand a whole new way of looking at the world. These are often framed as either weak or strong versions of the paradigm, and like the golden mean or Goldilocks, the truth is somewhere in the middle. In this talk, I'm going to purposely err on the side of presenting the strong version of the ecosystem model to contrast it to existing pipeline and pathway metaphors, with the full realization that likely my characterization is going to go too far in many cases. So here you see the difference between a weak and a strong model. Before we get fully into ecosystems, it's worth providing some context needed for discussions of complexity in systems. Not all systems are the same. There are a lot of different ways you can think about systems, but one of the more useful, in my opinion, is to think of 4 domains. These 4 domains are the 4 quadrants that have the sort of wiggly black shape with disorder in the middle. Depending on which domain the system happens to be in, the way you act or navigate situations changes. This is well captured by Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework, which is shown here. The 4 domains are simple in the bottom left, complicated in the upper left, complex, which is on the upper right, and chaotic, which is on the bottom right. We're going to ignore the chaotic domain because this really is a domain you want to get out of if you're stuck in, and it's not worth talking about in the time we have. The next slides are going to look at these in more detail, except for chaos. And so let's get into this. Let's start with the simple domain. The simple or obvious domain represents the pipeline model, or also the stuff you know you know. This means that there are well-defined rules or best practices, and the system does not change with time. At least it doesn't change on the scale in which you want to work or intervene in the system. For simple systems, the relationship between cause and effect is clear. The Cynefin framework gives the advice that effective action in such systems is to sense, categorize, and respond. You can see that with the yellow Roman numerals. First, you establish the facts or sense. Second, you figure out which of the rules or theories that you know apply, categorize. And then third, you take action by simply applying the rule and responding to what you need to do. We like to have our systems operate in this regime, since such systems, once learned, are easy to work with and in. As Daniel Kahneman points out, our minds are lazy. This is the domain engineering strives to achieve, and part of the reason why models like pipelines are so appealing. You can have standard operating procedures. You can operate by hard and fast rules, like never start a land war in Asia, or never go against a Sicilian when death is on the line. And decision-making is based on intellectual modes of thinking that faculty and engineers are good at. Find the proper rule and apply it. The problem comes when we apply the modes of thinking in this domain and the system we're operating in is in a different domain. For example, in simple systems, the best practice is by definition, what worked in the past should work now. But this can get you into trouble if you're working in a dynamic or changing system. Operating in this domain, the simple domain, in a system that is changing can result in the system shifting clockwise into the chaotic domain. The types of jobs that occur in simple systems are the ones that robots are going to be doing in the near future. The complicated domain corresponds to the pathways model, where building a system has lots of moving parts that have to work together, and also the domain of things you know you don't know. Many larger engineering problems occur in this domain. A fair amount of what we teach in engineering are ways to be able to break these larger, complicated problems into separate and simple problems. In this domain, the relationship between cause and effect requires analysis or expertise, and there can be a range of right answers. Because of the number of possible solutions, the Cynefin framework recommends a sense, analyze, respond approach, where you first see the whole system in its parts, sense it, explore the facts as you know them, analyze, and then based on your expertise, apply the most appropriate solution in responding. In this domain, it's possible to work toward a solution using judgment and expertise. Much of our conversation in engineering education is about how to get our students to develop the expertise to manage works in this domain through projects, design, etc. These types of problems are amenable to AI solutions using things such as IBM's computer, which beat Garry Kasparov in chess, or Google's AlphaGo winning against an expert Go player. The complex domain represents the ecosystem model and the domain of things you don't know you don't know. The domain operates on different mental rules than purely rational and intellectual thought. In essence, the complexity of the situation means that cause and effect only become clear in retrospect, if ever, and there are no unequivocal answers. This is often the domain of systems involving people, which are dynamic and tend to fluctuate between complicated and chaotic realms. They're first simplified by humans from the complex to the complicated, and then in responding to environmental effects, move back into the complex domain. While rules and expertise help you cope with simple and complicated systems, they can actually be a hindrance to the complex domain because the configuration is changing. In this domain, what matters more is preparation, the ability to follow heuristics that allow you to make iterative changes and adjust your strategy as you receive feedback. Heuristics, you will recall from discussing Billy Cohen at the start of the talk, are rules of thumb. In other words, conduct continual experiments that are safe to fail, so you're always sensing the environment. The Cynefin framework calls this process probe, sense, respond, and this is based more on general heuristics than hard and fast rules. Some examples are battlefields. For example, the U.S. Marines have the heuristics keep moving, seek the high ground, and stay in touch. Stock markets, ecosystems, and organizational cultures. Another heuristic for complex system is how Mark Twain likened humor to a frog. Explaining humor is a lot like dissecting a frog. You learn a lot in the process, but in the end you kill it. The reason that this is appropriate is that your actions in a complex system can change the situation in unpredictable ways. Simply you being in a complex system affects the system. The Cynefin framework gives a broad overview of different types of systems and how to act in them. The basic takeaway is that depending on the model you adopt, pipeline, pathways, or ecosystem, the sets of actions and approaches are going to be fundamentally different. In an ecosystem, the techniques we often use in engineering are not appropriate or fully effective. In an ecosystem, models need to change over time because the change in ecosystems is continuous, dynamic, and we'll get more into this later. Also, depending on how you draw the boundaries of an ecosystem, it can change over time, and sometimes, as we'll see, these changes can be fast. Frameworks like pipelines and pathways, simple and complicated, make assumptions about system stability that may not always be true. Engineering education research is deeply embedded in ideas of causality that may also not apply well in the complex domain. With this background, let's briefly discuss the three characteristics of ecosystems introduced earlier, that they are complex, systems, and living. The first characteristic is that ecosystems are complex, Now, complexity is developing or has developed into a science all by itself, and it's going to be far too broad to go into any depth here. But I want to talk about some key aspects that define complex system, because an ecosystem is almost by definition complex and is going to exhibit characteristics of complex systems. This isn't an exhaustive list, but complex systems have emergence. Out of interactions between the individual elements that make up the system, behavior emerges at the level of the system as a whole that's different than the behavior that can be expressed by each piece of the system. This so-called higher order behavior isn't a function of the parts of the system like it would be in a complicated system. Rather, emergence goes beyond any one of the parts is capable. In other words, the whole is more than the sum of the parts, as Aristotle said a long time ago. Another characteristic of complex systems is that they have sudden transitions, tipping points, and nonlinearities. Complex systems show nonlinear dynamics, which means they may suddenly change their behavior or move to a different regime of operation. They can also move from a high degree of stability to very unstable behavior or vice versa in relatively short periods of time. An example of these last in human systems might be revolutions or financial crises. The third is limited predictability. Because of these nonlinearities, the behavior of complex systems can't be predicted well into the future, and small changes in initial conditions, history, or external factors can lead to different dynamics over time. And the future of complex systems is therefore quite uncertain. Similarly, you can get large changes from small inputs, also a result of nonlinearity. And this happens more often if a complex system is close to a tipping point, ready to go into another state. Such behavior is a result of the interconnectivity of complex systems, the fact that all the pieces are connected together. Complex systems also exhibit memory or history. And this memory isn't located at a specific place, but distributed throughout the system. In other words, any complex system is a history, and this history is of cardinal importance to understanding the behavior of the system. You can't understand complex systems without understanding where they've been. The behavior of complex system is determined by interactions more than elements of the system. Again, the particular components don't matter. The way they are connected and the way they interact is what determines complexity. And this makes complex systems adaptive and self-organized. They can reorganize their internal structure without external intervention, and thus they can operate without central control. For example, nobody controls an ecosystem. It just operates. That's an example of being adaptive and self-organized. And this kind of organization occurs from the bottom up. So from complexity science, the conclusion is that learning, which is very broadly defined, arises not only internally within the student, but from the structure of the student's environment, the types of connectivity it enables. From this perspective, it may make the most sense to think of at least part of a student's development as an emergent phenomena that can be helped or hindered by their environment. And it's important then to focus on structures within educational systems as well as pedagogies. From the viewpoint of complexity, it's not just the individual student that's important, but the collective of students and faculty that are structurally coupled together in the learning environment. Now, we'll get back into this a little bit later, but in terms of belief systems or philosophies, broadly, complexity aligns with a set of philosophies known as interobjectivity, that an individual makes sense of the world through relationships mediated by and through objects or the environment. And Davis, in his book, Inventions of Teaching, discusses several different philosophical frameworks used in education and finds that interobjectivity, or modes of teaching based on interobjectivity, are still pretty uncommon. Another almost definitional observation about ecosystems is that they are systems. The idea of systems, as mentioned previously, goes back to ancient Greek philosophers such as Aristotle and the study of teleology, which is commonly expressed as the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Teleology defines something in terms of its purpose, telos, purpose, plus logos, reason. Teleology was generally ignored in favor of more positivistic philosophies by Western sciences from which modern engineering derived. Systems today are described by systems science or systems thinking, which arose as a synthetic and interdisciplinary field from organismal biology. Advances in computational methods in solving differential equations back in the 1960s saw increased rigor and activity, which was focused first around cybernetics and later biology. The idea of systems science has been generalized to organizational and social systems, where it's more generally known as systems thinking. Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems, Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline, and David Peter Stroh's System Thinking for Social Change are good books that introduce these ideas. Now, systems thinking is related to complexity and seeks to provide insights on how connections and interdependencies lead to behaviors which are difficult to explain through more positivistic linear frameworks. In the systems thinking tradition, the parts work to produce a greater whole, leading to the definition of a system as a set of things interconnected in a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. Systems thinking draws methods from engineering, such as using mathematical models, creating diagrammatic representations to map systems. You can see one of those here, as well as a heuristic-driven process for engaging with systems productively. The figure in the slide shows one of the techniques common in working with systems, which is to map them. Mapping systems is important because their behaviors are often opaque, nonlinear, and have significant lags. That's what the red tau on the figure is supposed to mean, and that double hash mark represents a lag. Also, the fact that systems are interconnected means you can't understand the behavior until you understand the relationship of the parts. And these representational maps are built by connecting entities in the system and identifying forms of interconnection that lead to behaviors that include circular reinforcing and damping loops. And this is very similar to the control systems in engineering. The importance of response times or lags and pools of reservoirs of resources, which also can cause leads or lags in systems behavior. The map you see here is one a student of mine built to try to understand systemic factors that affected the academic performance of economically insecure students at my institution. The key part of this diagram is that various actions or entities are mapped relationally to one another. Loops are identified, and the loops are identifying as contributing to either positive reinforcing feedback loops or negative braking or damping feedback loops. In maps such as these, the behavior depends upon the relationships or interconnections rather than the specifics of the node. Each of the nodes corresponds to a structure or a behavior that's been observed in the system. Now, over time, certain types of system features have been found to repeat across very different scenarios, and these have been listed and identified, and a couple of examples of these, which can easily be found in the larger literature, are things called fixes that backfire. That's shown in this diagram right here. A quick fix improves the symptoms of a system temporarily, but does not change, but rather reinforces the underlying dynamic that causes the behavior you don't want. So the situation soon worsens. And this is seen all the way over on the right as the oscillating curve that goes up over time, leading to worse and worse behavior. Others of these systems archetypes are shifting the burden. In other words, quick fixes rather than addressing hard underlying issues. Limits to growth. Systems tend to respond and push back against change, which slows or stops progress over time. Another one is success to the successful, that the resources you acquire basically lead to some parts of the system doing very well while others don't. And this typically shows up as power laws. We'll see one of these a little bit later on. Others are documented in the referenced books, and so feel free to look those up. It's important to note that these maps are created by getting stakeholders together, telling stories or narratives about their role in the systems and their observations. So there are both qualitative and quantitative research components involved, but the key point is you do this to map the system to understand its interrelationships. Now, for real social systems, these maps can get extraordinarily complicated, or more accurately, complex. For example, this is a map created to understand the situation on the ground during the recent war in Afghanistan. A key point of systems of such complexity is that linear fixes don't work. If you act on one part of the system based on a linear conception of how you can change something and fix it, you're most likely going to change the system in ways you don't expect and won't be in the long run beneficial to your goal. This is a key point that arises from ecosystem perspectives. You have to understand, in other words, map, the system you want to intervene in before you try to make changes. Failing to do this often results in failure to meet your objectives. I've seen very few of these types of maps in work in engineering education, likely because of the more positivist paradigms that are drawn from engineering. Now, changing systems is not like an engineering project in the simple or complicated domain of the Cynefin framework. and the ways to intervene in systems are different than those for engineering projects in many cases. If we adopt an ecosystem metaphor, then we need to think of engineering education as a system, not a series of disconnected learning opportunities. And it turns out that the interconnected nature of systems means the types of interventions you need to do to change their behavior are going to be more or less effective than they would be in a simple or a complicated system where engineers typically work. Interventions in systems are shown here, and these are drawn from Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems. The less effective interventions are at the top, and the generally more effective interventions are at the bottom. And note that these should be thought of heuristics, not hard and fast rules, because every system is different. Some will work for some systems, but not for others. What's important to note here is that many of the interventions that are funded at the policy level are aimed at changing the size and the flow of stocks and buffers. In other words, pools of students, which don't really address systemic change. Another key point is that we all have responsibility for making the system as it is. We are part of the system we want to change. So we have responsibility for the problems we see, and we must be willing to address these before we seek to change others or the system as a whole. I can't stress the point of individual responsibility as it arises in the eco perspective enough. Now, there's been a lot here, but to put it in context, it's worth quoting Donella Meadows from her brilliant article called Dancing with Systems, because this really, I think, captures the systems perspective, which is a part of ecosystems. The goal of foreseeing the future exactly and preparing for it perfectly is unrealizable. The idea of making a complex system do just what you want it to do can be achieved only temporarily at best. We can never fully understand our world, not in the way our reductionist science has led us to expect. Our science itself, from quantum theory to the mathematics of chaos, leads us into irreducible uncertainty. For any objective other than the most trivial, we can't optimize. We don't even know what to optimize. We can't keep track of everything. We can't find a proper sustainable relationship to nature, each other, or the institutions we create if we try to do it from the role of omniscient conqueror. Systems thinking leads to another conclusion, however, waiting, shining, obvious as soon as we stop being blinded by the illusion of control. It says there is plenty to do of a different sort of doing. The future can't be predicted, but it can be envisioned and brought lovingly into being. Systems can't be controlled, but they can be designed and redesigned. We can't surge forward with certainty into a world of no surprises, but we can expect surprises and learn from them and even profit from them. We can't impose our will upon a system. We can listen to what the system tells us and discover how its properties and our values can work together to bring forth something much better than could ever be produced by our will alone. While the second characteristic of ecosystems was that they're systems, the third characteristic is that they're living. Living systems are self-organizing. They pull in energy or resources from the environment and use these to organize or increase their order. Such living systems have three general characteristics. First, they're self-organizing. Self-organization provides a pattern that distinguishes the system characteristics. So in this way, living systems are complex systems. The pattern of organization distinguishes the living systems from other living systems. Second, structure is the embodiment of an organization of a living system. Remember, structure is an arrangement of components that determines the behavior of a system. In other words, the behavior of the system is an embodiment of its organization. Third, living systems have processes that maintain their organization. They're open systems. They exist away from equilibrium, and they require flows of resources to maintain themselves, relying on nonlinear interactions with their environment to do so. So if we're going to use an ecosystem analogy, we have to shift our view from things to organization. The property of autopoiesis is another property of living systems, and that is that living systems reproduce and maintain themselves. Again, autopoietic systems are not ones where the elements or components of the system remain fixed, but rather the network of relationships that maintains organization does. An example in engineering education might be a discipline. Individuals move in and out, journals come and go, techniques change, but somehow the coherence of a discipline is maintained as it evolves. Remember back to curriculum theory. This maintenance of the structure of a discipline is the underlying motive of those who have a scholar academic philosophy. The key point is that in an autopoietic system, the system can maintain its organization while changing its structure. The analogy of autopoiesis in engineering education systems is that an organization reproduces itself despite changing environmental circumstances, at least up to a point. While elements of the system can change, what the system is organized to do does not. Next, living systems have dissipative structures. This is a seemingly contradictory term that means they maintain themselves away from equilibrium by consuming and excreting resources. Just like a faculty member, resources are required for them to survive. While the idea of equilibrium is well defined in living systems, the analogy for an engineering education ecosystem is not so clear. For a first pass, consider equilibrium as a state of balance where energy is often minimized. The lowest effort and cost option for a degree, canned lecture, out-of-the-book homework, multiple choice online tests for easy grading. This isn't stasis, and students are going to move through the system, but equilibrium. Because living systems exist generally far from equilibrium, they're subject to change. That is, environmental changes can cause them to change their form and assume new states. I suppose building on the former analogy for engineering education programs that utilize resources to be unstable, to exist far from the lowest energy state, gives those programs an ability to evolve their form. Systems that live near the bottom of the energy well, deep in equilibrium, have more difficulty changing, perhaps. Because autopoietic systems can change structure while maintaining organization, they are strongly coupled to their environment, which is known as structural coupling. This allows the organism to adapt to changing environments. So for an organization, this creates a potential tension between the need for the organization to maintain itself, but also the need to keep up with environmental changes by modifying its structures. In other words, how do you distinguish organization from structure, at least in engineering education? Well, there are lots of examples of this idea, one of which is the adaptation of technology, such as online courses, being accomplished most quickly by for-profit institutions, which need to respond more quickly to environmental factors and are thus more strongly coupled to their environment. Another example is the dramatic increase in untenured faculty, which came in response to environmental stressors on the financial and political sides. What structural coupling means is that the organism and its environment co-evolve. The structure of the organism changes through structural coupling, but its organization does not. That is, the organism maintains self-coherence. This is shown on the slide as the big circular diagram. This is a very important concept because it allows a new definition for cognition. There is a theory known as the Santiago theory that broadly redefines cognition as an autopoietic network adapting to its environment through coupling to the environment. In the Santiago theory, cognition is tied to structural coupling and thus does not require the use of abstract symbols. Of course, organisms don't restructure themselves to all environmental changes, only some. This coupling between an organism and its environment, as well as between other organisms through their coupling to the same environment, is what forms an ecosystem. An ecosystem, in other words, are the couplings that matter, and so ecosystems, as mentioned earlier, are defined by the relationships rather than the entities within the ecosystem. Such adaptation or cognition defines an ecosystem, since only such dynamic equilibrium within the larger system can give rise to a definable ecosystem. Adaptation through this structural coupling is critical for the formation and maintenance of ecosystems. The interactions between an organism and its environment are known as its world. Worlds in this use of the word are states of existence that arise between an organism's structure and its coupling to the environment. The world that an organism inhabits determines its future possibilities. Worlds are idiosyncratic and depend on structure and environment. The process of cognition, or adaptive structural coupling, brings forth a world for the organism in which they exist. Their world is embedded in the larger ecosystem, but it is not the whole ecosystem. The world is brought forth by the parts of the ecosystem the organism is connected to, not the parts it isn't. Thus, different species within the same ecosystem, even when they are co-located, can inhabit very different worlds. I don't want to extend this analogy too far, but by pushing it into the domain of engineering education, one can imagine different students who choose different activities or live in different places, having different worlds within the same degree program. Since coupling is determined by the structure of the organism, structure is key to our potentialities, barring significant external change within that ecosystem. Thus, our world is determined by our structure, and if structure changes, new worlds can arise. As Noah Yuval Harari theorizes in his book *Sapiens*, one of the things that distinguishes humankind from other species and has led to our dominance of our environment, what we're now calling the Anthropocene, is that we can be organized not just by physical phenomena, but also by ideas and emotion. When an organism couples to its own beliefs, it creates an internal world as well as an external world. Again, this internal world can change by changing the structure of the belief systems, which has been a theme throughout this conversation. It's worth considering with these ecosystem definitions that education can be characterized as the process of changing internal beliefs or structure, ideally opening up new and better worlds for the individual. In both ecosystems and engineered or economic systems, organisms or organizations need to consume resources to maintain positions away from equilibrium, because being away from equilibrium allows one to change. However, ecosystems are sustainable, since what is a waste product for one species is resources for another. I'm not really clear how to interpret this for engineering education, since we get back to a dystopian Soylent Green view of the world if we start to think of our students as resources. With the ideas of complexity, systems, and life, what are some of the properties of larger ecosystems? The basic properties are listed below, and they give rise to properties of an ecosystem as a whole, which exists across scales. One of these is homeostasis, the fact that coupling in an ecosystem tends to keep it in or near a dynamically stable state. Homeostasis only goes so far because an ecosystem can be forced out of this state by external changes. You can also think of homeostasis as dynamic equilibrium, since the components of an ecosystem each exist away from equilibrium. Ecosystems also require flow. They must have a flow of resources to maintain homeostasis. A biological ecosystem, then, is generally closed to the flow of matter since it recycles the same materials, but open to flows of energy and information. The boundary of defining open and closed determines the boundary of the ecosystem. Matter flows internally to an ecosystem, and the health of the ecosystem depends on maintaining flows. Hoarding resources tends to make an ecosystem unhealthy. We'll get to that in a little bit. Note that flow is related to cognition through structural coupling. Another example is that ecosystems as a whole are resilient. Resilience is how well an ecosystem can respond to an external or external change as determined by resisting damage and recovering quickly from some external change. Resilience is measured by other factors that will be discussed later and can either be desirable or an undesirable aspect of an ecosystem for obvious reasons. One might say the engineering education ecosystem has proven to be highly resilient, even for some aspects that are generally agreed not to help students, such as a lack of inclusion and equity or the prevalence of passive modes of teaching. Ecosystems are diverse. Now, diversity in relation to ecosystem means that tasks are shared between different species. For example, bees, butterflies, and birds can serve to pollinate plants. In an organization, the analogy is sharing of responsibilities and capabilities. Diversity is also necessary for emergence and thus adaptation, and so diversity plays a role in resilience. Note that if one is thinking about diversity in terms of students, the definition of shared responsibilities brings up some very interesting ideas. Ecosystems often have keystone species, and a keystone species is a species within the ecosystem, which of course contains many different species, that has a disproportionately large effect on the environment it lives in compared to its overall abundance. Top predators are one example of a keystone species due to the fact they keep populations under control through predation. Keystone species can also connect many different niches of the ecosystem together. A good example of the latter in engineering education would be an experienced NSF program officer. Ecosystems have nestedness. This is a measure that determines overlaps in the interaction or grouping among clusters of species. Let's look at an example. If two different clusters correspond to two different islands, and if these two clusters of species have a lot of overlap, then the nestedness is high. If there's little overlap of the species that populate the two different islands, then the nestedness would be low. High nestedness contributes to resilience. As an example, ABET criteria provide nestedness in engineering education by promoting overlaps and interaction. The competition for status between programs likely helps nestedness by making sure new capabilities become broadly adopted, but hurts by limiting the resources available for some programs. Health is a useful but vague parameter when it comes to ecosystems since it depends on what is desirable. Health in ecosystems is often framed in terms of productivity, or what you can harvest from the ecosystem, resilience, the ability to resist external stressors such as harvesting, and organization or biodiversity, the number of species supported. The same vagueness would seem to apply for an engineering education ecosystem because whether it is healthy or not depends on what one desires from the ecosystem. And then the third characteristic is panarchy or punctuated equilibrium, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So the takeaway from all these bullet points is that ecosystems are by definition stable, closed to some flows and open to others, and defined by their relationships. Generally, sharing and cooperation help maintain the ecosystem. If you'd like to take a more dialectic stance on the different models or metaphors, basically pipelines, pathways, or ecosystems, you can see an emerging clash in values between engineering and economics on one hand and ecology on the other. Many of the same ideas derived for life in complex systems have been adapted to human organizations. There are parallels, but not an exact correspondence of ideas. Now, one of the really useful frameworks that's drawn from both biological and organizational ecosystems is that of panarchy. Panarchy is an integrative theory that seeks to explain the evolving nature of complex adaptive systems. Panarchy, which comes from pan, all, and archy, or rule, in other words, overarching rule, is the hierarchical structure in which systems of nature, for example, forests, grasslands, lakes, rivers, and seas, as well as human systems, are interlinked in never-ending adaptive cycles of growth, accumulation, restructuring, and renewal. And we'll get into what those are in just a bit. These scales are shown on the figure on the left. Each of these words corresponds to a different stage of a repeating cycle. These transformational cycles take place in nested sets at scales range from a leaf to the biosphere over periods from days to geological epochs. And if you look at the figure on the left, you'll see the log scale, both in terms of time and in terms of space, that correspond to the different regions and subregions within an organization or biological ecosystem. So in essence, panarchy as a theory looks for organizational behavioral similarities across scales. It also looks at these system hierarchies based on temporal and spatial scales, as shown in the figure on the left. Now, hierarchical levels in the system are formed from the interactions that share similar speeds and spatial attributes. So things that are on the same scale and operate on the same time scale tend to interact. Each level in space or time communicates a small set of information or quantity of material to the next higher, slower, and coarser level. This selectivity is important. Ecosystems don't do a complete data dump from the bottom up. Rather, the hierarchies are formed around what is important for the functioning of the higher level. In engineering, particularly electrical and computer engineering, the analogy is abstraction, and in fact the idea for panarchy came from the same source, Herb Simon. Upper levels in the panarchy structure are slow, while lower levels are fast, and serve as places where experiments occur that over time can affect the larger, slower, more macroscopic levels. Despite the difference in scale, a form of dynamic experimentation called an adaptive cycle plays out in a similar way on each of these different scales across space and time, but of course on different temporal and spatial scales. This cycle is shown in the figure on the right, and three factors influence this adaptive cycle that looks kind of like an infinity sign. First is the potential or wealth of a system. This is just the resources it's able to tap into. Second is the connectedness, how agile the system is in responding to change. If you have too little connectedness, it makes the system subject to external effects, while too much connectedness leads to rigidity and a lack of adaptability of the system. The third is resilience, the ability to resist external change. Now, over time, parts of the ecosystem move through periods of high and low potential, connectedness, and resilience in a cyclical way. The cycle, shown on the figure to the left, corresponds to the part of the ecosystem. And this part of the ecosystem starts in exploitation. This is in the quadrant on the lower right. And exploitation has low connectedness and low potential or low wealth. The entity in question then exploits natural resources in the environment to build both more connection and more potential. This is shown as the arrows moving upward and to the right on the infinity sign looking figures. As time goes on, they tie up more and more of the resources and become more highly interconnected. This accumulation and connection continues until they become so connected they're not agile anymore and have tied up many of the available resources from the ecosystem. The phase of moving from exploitation in the lower right to conservation in the upper left happens slowly, since it takes time to accumulate resources and build connections. And this corresponds in the organism or organization to a period of growth and relative stability. Then some external event occurs. Perhaps it's a fire, drought, an innovation, a social movement that the rich and rigid entity cannot adequately respond to because it's not agile. Such events are unpredictable, and compared with conservation, they happen on a very fast time scale. As the organism or organization collapses, then the accumulated resources are quickly released back into the environment. And you can look at Piketty's famous book for examples of the economic case of this. And these released resources stimulate experiment and innovation in the larger ecosystem. Following the creative destruction, the ecosystem reorganizes itself to start the cycle again in the exploitation phase, perhaps in a new form. The adaptive cycle of panarchy leads to the idea of punctuated equilibrium. This is that changes in a seemingly stable system happen rapidly and unpredictably. And this quote from Holling's paper on this captures the idea well. It is as if two separate objectives are functioning, but in sequence. The first maximizes production and accumulation. The second maximizes invention and reassortment. The two objectives cannot be maximized simultaneously, but only occur sequentially. And the success in achieving one inexorably sets the stage for its opposite. The adaptive cycle therefore embraces two opposites: growth and stability on the one hand, change and variety on the other. The theory of panarchy then makes the case that this type of change, accumulation followed by collapse and reorganization, is both healthy, natural, and cyclical, and it provides insights on how change occurs across many different scales of an ecosystem. Panarchy recognizes that ecosystems exist across a wide range of scales, and that punctuated equilibrium can happen at one scale and not necessarily affect the ecosystem on other scales. The smaller scales of the ecosystem move more quickly through the cycle, while the larger scales move slowly. Thus, ecosystems function by the smaller scales potentially stimulating change at the larger scales, which is called revolt. And so you can see the small scale in the system revolting and affecting the medium-sized scale in this image. And the larger scales provide resources and stability during the reorganization phase, which is called remember. Again, the large scale at the top provides resources as the medium scale reorganizes. In this way, ecosystems are both innovative and dynamic while also being stable and conserving. These properties arrive from interactions across scales, and this is why it's important to consider scale and connection if you think of a larger engineering education ecosystem. Panarchy also explains why more radical changes across an entire ecosystem is very rare. The cycles on different scales must be in temporal alignment as well as spatial alignment for catastrophic change to occur across multiple scales. For example, for the revolt from a smaller scale to trigger change at the larger scales, the revolt phase of the smaller scale must align temporally and spatially with the nadir of the conservation stage of the larger scale. Again, this is shown in the diagram, and so on up the panarchy. Note that in the complete theory, human systems exhibit characteristics that can break from this general model. As with every model, there are always exceptions. Some of the differences between human and natural systems are that human systems have foresight and intentionality, they can communicate, and they have access to technology. Now, it turns out that comparisons between natural and organizational ecosystems have more similarities than differences, however. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over this slide, which lists the similarities and differences between human and natural ecosystems. You can read through it yourself fairly quickly. Rather, I would like to move on and take a look at an example of a possible engineering education ecosystem to ground this work a little bit more. Several years ago, I was invited to a workshop at the National Academy of Engineering that focused on how to get people to better communicate their work in engineering education to policymakers. This slide is directly copied from that workshop. We often assume that our only audience is other researchers and don't frame the impact of our work around questions being asked at higher levels in the panarchy or even at lower levels sometimes. The workshop drew in folks from a lot of different sectors, including academia, industry, government, and foundations. One of the exercises we asked people to do was to think of themselves as a niche in a larger ecosystem, and then identify specific persons or organizations that served as inputs and outputs to their niche. We asked for both first and second order connections, i.e. your inputs, and the inputs of your inputs, the second order. This is shown on the top part of the slide. On the bottom, we had people identify the capacities and capabilities of both their inputs and outputs using the influencer framework, as well as their motivation to work with you and their ability to do so on personal, social, and structural dimensions. Getting the responses of inputs and outputs from all participants led to this map, which was initially generated by Jeremy London. Again, like many of these system diagrams, this is an eye chart, but it gives you a possible map of an engineering education ecosystem. Note that the participants identified not just entities such as universities or industries, but also skills, resources, ideas, information as part of the ecosystem. All of these are part of the larger system and structure of engineering education. It's important to remember that these types of maps depend on participants and how they are connected. The map is process dependent, as well as how the information was obtained. For this reason, it's important to understand that this is a map, not the map. The idea of one of many possible rather than final product is a valuable distinction, since given the dynamic nature of engineering education, it's likely there never is and never will be the map. The ecosystem is defined by the interrelationships between the entities, and as an ecosystem, it would have properties that themselves emerge from it being complex, a system, and living. Again, we've gotten down into some of the details and drifted away from philosophy and technological and engineering literacy, so I want to try to bring it back. The idea of an ecosystem suggests elements of a philosophy that does not seem to align well with that of engineering or technology or science, at least not at first glance. Science tends to adopt a positivist and rational philosophy. Engineering, however, has been argued by Goldman to be more based on contingent reasoning. In other words, context matters in engineering. Engineering works are most effective when they're designed for local environments. In the language we've been developing, another way of putting this is that engineering coupling to the environment deeply matters. Yet still, engineering mostly holds with rationalist, empiricist modes of thinking. What I'm trying to say here is, again, that the way we view the world, our mental models and our beliefs matter. In the book Inventions of Teaching, Davis has created the diagram of a tree representing Western thought and shows that different modes of education arise from major trends in Western thought, and the different branches of this tree that correspond with different modes of thought result in different philosophies of learning. The first branch, or branching point, closest to the trunk, is one's view of the nature of the universe, which can be metaphysical, i.e. nature is determined, which is grounded in religious origin myths, or the other branch is a physical understanding, correspond to nature as emergent, which comes from things like evolution. From each of these belief systems arose ideas of what are accepted as sources of knowledge. Rationalism and empiricism, upon which of most engineering is based, are branches from episteme, or a belief in the value of objective truth. Truth is determined either theoretically in rationalism or through experience and experiment in empiricism, and both are valued in engineering education. From our beliefs in what constitutes truth arise different conceptions of how we should teach, such as lecture, which is revealing truth, or project-based learning, which is discovering truth through experimentation and experience. The complexity and ecological philosophies that I'm talking about that apply to the ecosystem metaphor STEM, no pun intended, from a different branch of the tree. This branch is a philosophy broadly known as interobjectivity, the idea our knowledge of the world is determined by relationships mediated by and through objects of the environment. This is a very different perspective than those more common in engineering and the sciences, rationalism and empiricism. Because the individual is embedded and connected, rather than standing alone to determine the truth by wresting it from the world. Now, it's a bit of a side note, but the inter-objective frameworks actually align in some ways with Eastern thought, particularly Zen Buddhism and some elements of Hinduism, more than they do with Western thought. There's not a complete philosophy here by any means, hardly even the beginnings of one. But the ecosystem perspective does more than provide another framework to understand broadening participation. It offers a very different way of looking at engineering education that potentially can give very different perspectives rather than viewing it through an engineering lens. First of all, the engineering education system is complex. It can exhibit properties of emergence, memory, and nonlinearities where small inputs lead to large outputs. Next, engineering education is a system that's defined more by relationships than the properties of the entities that make up the system. To stimulate change in engineering education, it is important to map the system to understand its relationships, identify archetypes commonly found in systems, and make small iterative changes to tweak or nudge the system toward a desired state. Systems cannot be controlled, not in the way we'd like to. Also, simple linear solutions often aren't effective and may make the desired situation worse. An engineering education ecosystem has analogies with living systems. It can display properties of autopoiesis, that is, it seeks to maintain its organization in the face of environmental change. It pushes against change. While it is defined by its organization, its structure determines its coupling to the larger environment. Changes are cosmetic unless they address structure. It exists away from equilibrium by consuming resources, and the greater the distance from equilibrium, the more able it is to shift form or evolve to new states. Change comes with the risk and instability. Entities within the ecosystem have varying ability to adapt to changes in the environments, which is broadly defined as cognition. This form of cognition exists without abstract symbolism. Adaptability is defined by the ability to make structural changes, and such adaptability is the most important trait for succeeding within the larger ecosystem. Through its interactions with its environment, an entity creates its own world, and all entities interacting with the environment bring forth the ecosystem. Worlds exist inside ecosystems. To thrive, we must do so within our own world, not within others' worlds. And structure is key. Changing structure can bring forth new worlds without reorganization. Does reorganization equal death? Real change is structural change, but such change is very hard to achieve. What matters ultimately is not self, but relationships. And what does this say about our current academic culture? From this, it's possible to draw some broad assumptions or hypotheses. First, within an ecosystem, we all exist in worlds defined by our internal structure and how that couples to the environment we find ourselves in. It is this coupling that matters. Two people of identical ability in the same environment but with different structures determined by their history may live in very different worlds. The idea of a world gives some insights into how academic thriving could be defined as expanding possible worlds or capabilities within the student or institution's world. The self matters less than the structure and relationships. The central focus of our philosophies on the objective, independent self underestimate the effect of environment and structure. This suggests how we might shift our attention in the case of trying to improve engineering education. Next, our attempts to make change in engineering education will not be effective without first understanding and mapping the system, then recognizing our own role in creating the problems we are trying to solve. From panarchy, the geographic size and time required for change depends on scale. It's important to understand that change comes from the bottom up, supported and stabilized from organizations at larger scales. Models of change could benefit from the panarchy framework. The engineering education ecosystem is autopoietic, and it pushes back against change. The issues we seek to correct are simply the byproduct of the system working the way it is supposed to. Engineering fixes will not be effective at changing a living system. Rather, we must work within complex systems and nudge them in the directions we want them to go. These perspectives give more credence to the Cynefin framework's contrast between actions in simple systems, determining then applying the right solution, and complex systems of complex probing, sensing, and tweaking. Engineering education is complex, not simple or complicated. Seeking to push systems from complexity to simplicity is what we are typically trained to do in engineering. Emergent behavior in life-critical technologies is not a desirable outcome. But in engineering education, moving too far toward simplicity likely pushes the system toward equilibrium and thus greatly limits its capacity for change. We also judge our status and success in higher education by a lot of factors, but often adaptability is not one of them. It should be. Here is another role for philosophy in regards to the engineering education ecosystem, and that's the determination of value. Engineering education is not just a means to an undefined end, but an end in itself, since for most of our students, their engineering education will be their entire college education. Ecosystems aren't good or bad, they just are. They arise from endogenous factors to create stable environments and once formed resist change. What we want in engineering education to achieve is a question of values, and that is a deeply philosophical question. The fact that you can't really talk about an ecosystem's health without clarifying values is not a weakness of the ecosystem paradigm, but I believe a real strength. Unlike a pipeline model that suggests clear actions, such as fix leaks, even defining an ecosystem and setting metrics to determine health are highly value-laden and require dialogue and participation of all the stakeholders in the system. The philosophy that an ecosystem framework suggests is very different than that typically used in engineering. I have to admit I don't have a developed philosophy here, which is why this is framed as a conversation rather than a lecture, let alone a distinguished one. But there is a way forward suggested by Cohn's lecture of a decade ago, Systems Thinking and the Cynefin Framework. Rely on heuristics rather than rules, and learn to trust instincts based on immersion and engagement rather than experts. So for the rest of the conversation, I want to introduce some heuristics based on the engineering education ecosystem model that's been developed so far. These are very preliminary, and part of the conversation I want to stimulate is how to both improve and refine the heuristics we use in engineering education. The first heuristic is to develop situational awareness across scales. Drawing from Wikipedia here, situational awareness is the perception of environmental elements and events with respect to time or space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their future status. While ecosystems tend to be homeostatic, stay in dynamic equilibrium, they do respond to environmental pressures. So this heuristic arises from two of the principles discussed earlier, the need to stay coupled to the environment to be able to adapt, in other words, possess cognition, and the fact that ecosystems exist across scales and exert change pressures upwards and downwards. I'm going to argue that right now, at this place and at this time, it's really important to pay attention to the external environment through a series of quick vignettes on some of the environmental forces that are currently putting pressures on the engineering education ecosystem. I want to briefly go through some of these external factors that have implications for the engineering education ecosystem, looking at large-scale effects. There will also be local effects at scales below the big ones being addressed here, but I can't address those. The first of these is cost, and the basic story here is well known. The cost of college is rising faster than inflation. Cost is driving a lot of subsidiary trends, but the big takeaways are that the situation is not sustainable and it's not just. While it's not been widely publicized, there is some very recent evidence that private undergraduate universities are increasingly beginning to feel that they cannot continue to raise tuition. The rising cost of higher education is not driven by inefficiencies within the university, as pundits like Clayton Christensen and others suggest, but larger scale decisions on societal investments, as the inset shows. This is the fraction of tuition as a percent of revenue at public institutions. In brief, tuition has become more important as a sense of revenue for these public institutions as state and federal funding has fallen. The internal factors that drive the need to raise tuition are not poor investments or making big rec centers or the things you'll often hear about in the media, but increases in salaries in healthcare, which are going to rise regardless and can't be easily ignored for long stretches of time. On the cost front, it's interesting that while engineering has some of the highest returns on investment for graduates, it's also one of the most expensive undergraduate degree programs to offer. It costs on average more than half again as much as the average degree program. This is an important issue, but how much work in engineering education is focused on controlling costs? Here's another way to look at this data. If we combine the cost of college with income inequality, we can see how the cost of an average public in orange or private in blue college education has changed as a fraction of annual income for each income ventile. So you've got your income ventiles on the x-axis. The comparison is from 1976, which are the circles, to 2016, the squares, over a 40-year period. And to aid in interpreting the graph, the black line corresponds to spending 100% of one's annual income on college. So from this you can see, by seeing the shift between 2016 and 1976, how public and private institutions have increased in cost beyond 1 year's salary for a larger and larger fraction of the American population. This is a chart pulled from The Economist that shows that the annual return on investment for a STEM degree is independent of the prestige of a school and only weakly correlated for arts and humanities degree. So why does this matter for our heuristic of situational awareness? The reason is that graphs like this are intended to send a message. This and many other figures that I could have shown here are all sending the same basic message. The value of a college degree is not what it once was. This has created a real conundrum, which is a mock Latin word for riddle, since while a college degree has arguably become more necessary to one's personal economic success, it has also become less affordable. While this might be interpreted as simple supply and demand, these are the types of economic arguments that raise questions about justice. From a more pragmatic perspective, recent figures on student indebtedness, which in the U.S. are about $1.5 trillion, and the macroeconomic effects of this indebtedness are all having an effect on policymakers and the public's perception of college. This has opened the door for a lot of new players who are trying to get into the credentialing space that was once a monopoly of higher education. There are a lot of reasons for this educational gold rush. Part of it is perceptions of the doors technology is opening. Others are the perceived issues in cost and accessibility. Others are the fact that the U.S. spends about $1 trillion a year for all forms of education, and people want in on that money. Last summer, a workshop as part of an NSF project really indicated how active the startup space was. This is often not noticed by more traditional engineering education, but over time, startups may have the largest effect on the overall ecosystem of all the factors discussed here. These innovations and experiments are being driven by technology will be dealt with in a separate heuristic, although its effect on the larger environment is immense. Now, while economic inequality exists between families and people, it also exists between educational institutions. The data on the left figure of this slide comes from a query to the IPEDS database and shows the distribution of schools sorted by assets per students in thousands of dollars. In other words, the data point at 200 on the y-axis corresponds to a school with assets of $200,000 per student. Note the logarithmic scale in the inset gives a better idea of the range of the wealth of universities, and even so, some of the wealthier schools are not shown. When you see power laws like this, they generally indicate success to the successful or rich get richer system archetypes. If you play with the IPEDS data a little bit more, you can make a scatter plot of assets versus enrollment on a log scale. That's shown over on the right. And you'll find areas of vulnerable school with low enrollment and low assets, and what I would call impervious school with high enrollment and or high assets. What is not obvious from this data is that half the schools in the U.S., at least the ones in the IPEDS database, are tightly clustered in the area of the red box. It's hard to interpret such data. but my sense is that it indicates that economic stresses will have little impact on the system until they reach the region of the red box, and then they may cascade rapidly. The basic story of large-scale data like this is that the engineering education ecosystem can be affected by and must adapt to external stressors. The impact of research in engineering education is going to depend on how well engineering educators remain aware of trends in the larger environment that may require them to make structural changes to adapt and survive. As an engineering student, faculty member, administrator, or policymaker, you must actively look across scales and have situational awareness. The second heuristic is that capital T technology has structure and organization but not cognition. I'll go into more details in a bit, but the basic argument here is that while technology, broadly speaking, instead of one specific technology, is strongly coupled to other change factors, by itself it is a catalyst for, rather than a driver of, adaptation. Technology is being adopted for a lot of reasons and developed to address the issues discussed above. It always has been. So let's join Bill and Ted and go back in time a little bit. This is circa 1350, over 650 years ago. At the time this picture was made, the price of one book was about the same as a small farm. The students are copying their books by hand, but this is a pretty worthwhile investment. Here you have somebody at the front of the classroom giving the lecture. All your good students are in the front row. As you move to the back of the classroom, you see somebody sleeping, students talking, and this guy doing whatever the medieval equivalent of the crossword puzzle was. In essence, higher education then was not that much different than it is today. It turns out that oral recitation and hand copying at the time was an effective way to transmit and store information. But it's important to remember that books are a technology, so much so that the invention of the printing press caused pretty significant changes to society. From oral transmission of information to reading, an information transfer rate increase of almost an order of magnitude occurred. Every new technology has the potential to change ecosystems, but it seems many of the promises of computers and the internet for education, in other words, ways to transfer and store information at much higher rates and in much greater densities, have not come to pass as envisioned. This quote is from Science more than 2 decades ago. The issue, of course, is that while reading a book is 10 times faster than copying a book, despite many orders of magnitude increase in transfer and storage in the years since, the limiting factor is still the human. I still get most of my information by reading. My children get it by watching videos. But changes on the horizon. This slide shows the improvement in error rate of machine recognition of image features. It's already pretty much out of date. The dashed line is the typical accuracy of a human being. What AI, artificial intelligence, or deep learning may do is remove humans from many tasks they are required for now. This will take time, but the trends seem pretty clear. As this graph shows, there are now and will continue to be in the future huge advantages to adopting technologies, so much so that it serves as environmental pressure in and of itself. But technology to date is designed for specific purposes that are envisioned by its creators, often engineers. This gives it organization, the guiding principles that determine its function in the larger environment. Technology also has a built-in structure, certain principles and capabilities it operates on that define and limit what it can do. But it does not adaptively change based on a need to respond to a changing environment. It does not yet possess cognition outside of very narrowly defined bounds. Now, because technology is helpful and saves time, we adopt it, and there are a lot of pressures to do so within universities beyond the cool or the wow factor. But once technology enters an educational ecosystem, it becomes embedded in that organization structure. Now, this can be very efficient and will become even more so as adaptive learning systems, more quality content, and better assessments are developed. We must remember, however, our possibilities for change and adaptation are determined by our structure. To effectively adapt, we need to change our structure while maintaining our organization. But as of now, technology once adopted and embedded in structure serves to maintain existing structures unless you adopt new technology. And anyone who has tried to roll out fundamentally new technologies within an organization knows how difficult that can be. So this second heuristic is to carefully bound the use of technologies. Use effective tools, but be careful about embedding them so deeply in your structures that change becomes impossible. The third heuristic has to do with the role of diversity in the engineering ecosystem framework. It's to consider diversity as cognition and world embracing. I don't really like the way I framed this, but I don't yet have anything better. The heuristic draws on a lot of different ideas, that individuals inhabit a coherent world within the ecosystem, that cognition is based on adaptation, that dissipative structures keep organisms away from equilibrium, that systems resist change, and change emerges from the bottom up in panarchy. Now, this is the opening paragraph from an influential national report. You can stop the video and read it if you want to. I included it because after you read it, look at the date. This was written 30 years ago. If this same message resonates with you today, then you might begin to think that some types of problems seem perpetual. From the systems thinking perspective, persistent problems are those that arise from a system's structure. Diversity, or broadening participation in engineering education, is one of these perpetual issues. I would argue that this is the issue in engineering education. If we cannot create an engineering education system that can provide equitable opportunities, then what other injustices does our work perpetuate? What use is trying to improve an unjust system? There are many in the audience who have devoted their lives to this issue and know much more than I do. As a white male engineer who spent much of my life in a narrow technical discipline, I came into engineering education late, but I'm slowly waking up. I want to acknowledge the contributions of the experts in this area while also speaking the truth that we're not doing enough. This, as you can see on the slide, is a table from an analysis of recommendations from high-level panels over 5 decades that I think was done within ASEE. These were all panels on diversity within engineering education. As you can see, many of the same recommendations are repeated over and over and over again. While in the intervening years there have been improvements, our population is much more diverse. Now, from a systems thinking and ecosystem perspective, these are classic system archetypes pointing to the need to make structural change. I'm not naive enough to suggest that an ecosystem framework is going to address such systemic problems, but I want to discuss some overlaps. Since this talk is about mental models, we should acknowledge that most of us have a mental image of a college student, say 18 to 24 years old, when in fact 40% of college students are over 25. Most college students live in a dorm. Actually, over 85% live off campus. Do college students rely on parental support? Well, half of them are financially independent. A college student attends a 4-year undergraduate degree program. Well, 35% are in 2-year colleges. Are most college students single and free and partying? Well, no, 25% are the parents of kids. What about the rich extracurricular opportunities college offers students? Well, nearly 60% of students work while in college. Do they attend school full-time? Except for the 40% that attend part-time. They are enjoying living the life of a young person in college by going out to the bar, getting drinks, keeping up with fashions, traveling for spring break. Well, not the 40% who live below the poverty line. And do college students come from educated middle-class families? Well, not the 30% who are first-generation college students. The shift in students, in fact, only about 30% are what we typically think of as traditional college students, is a significant change in the larger environment that is primarily coming from the bottom up. Although declining numbers of traditional students are going to create top-down pressures as well, particularly with the demographic shifts that are going to hit in 2026. This is the result of a major environmental shift. From the perspective of pipelines, what we need to do is tap unused resources. From the perspective of pathways, we need to create the paths that will let these students succeed. And from the perspective of ecosystems, it's a conversation about what we really want college to do. If we want the system we have, we need do nothing. As long as the environment does not change. Now, if we believe the environment is changing, and I hope I've convinced you it is, or if we believe the system that exists does not enable thriving for some within the system, then the ecosystem framework offers suggestions, even if they're hard to accomplish. Speaking as a former NSF program officer, several offers come to mind from the ecosystem perspective. One way forward is to better map the system. The work of Matt Olin, Susan Lords, and others is an example, but more needs to be done. Another thing we could do is to increase the connectivity in the system for those who do not currently have it. And the National Academy Pathways report has a lot of suggestions on how to do this. A third is to think about and develop metrics of ecosystem health and seek to apply them broadly. Now, the conditions within a single institution don't represent the entire ecosystem, and because a diversity of approaches is needed and nestedness confers resilience, it's never a good idea to apply a one-size-fits-all health metric, which is why we have to have conversations. Now, every change requires resources, which in turn requires convincing those who control access to these resources that shifting investments from where they currently are deployed to somewhere else is a good idea. The ecosystem framework can help in such arguments, since the definition of cognition for an organization is the ability to adapt to changing environments. To adapt requires that our organizations seek to stay away from equilibrium and unstable positions, despite the homeostatic and autopoietic pressures to maintain the status quo. In other words, prepare to be uncomfortable. Expend resources to move away from equilibrium and make the case that such discomfort is a valuable use of your resources, not just for image or justice, but for long-term survival in the changing ecosystem. We also have to start to take the hard step of changing structures. The ecosystem model emphasizes that structures must change: admissions procedures, funding mechanisms, transfer credits. There are a lot of suggestions in the Pathways report. But ultimately, these changes are going to be local and bottom-up and have to involve all stakeholders, particularly those who the current system does not work for. In the panarchy model, change comes from the bottom up, so to change you have to start at the scale of students and invest in a lot of small experiments. Finally, and most importantly, is to recognize the issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity are not policy questions. They are deeply personal questions, and we must recognize our own role in creating the situation that we now wish to change. Here, the idea of worlds within an ecosystem helps to provide some insights. Remember that each entity within an ecosystem exists in their own world, and these worlds are created by structural coupling. We cannot expect everyone to live in the same world unless they come from the same background, but we often act as if they do. It's really much more convenient to pretend this. I would argue that at the end of the day, the role of education is to introduce new worlds to students. And we can't do this if our own worldview is narrow, and we certainly can't do it if we're not kind enough, caring enough, or brave enough to enter the worlds of our students. The ecosystem perspective is clear that what matters are connections and relationships, not programs, institutions, or status. This is deeply personal. Like many others in the room, I carry scars of the time that I have personally failed to be kind and caring to students. On to the fourth heuristic. Heuristic number 4 is to enable emergence, connectivity, and flow. In this heuristic, the question we are dealing with is how to create an education system that works better for more people, and one answer is to relinquish some control. From panarchy, change and innovation occurs in lower levels of the ecosystem that operate on faster timescales. In other words, if you desire change, it is necessary to create opportunities for new structures to emerge on smaller scales that can work their way upward. From complexity theory, self-organizing behaviors can emerge in complex adaptive systems, but for this to happen, the system has to support feedback and clustering. In an ecosystem, change may be confined to a single niche unless there is some type of connection, often through a species that crosses niche boundaries. In the panarchy framework, innovation occurs at small and local scales, such as the red circle. By definition, there are many entities at this scale, and innovation occurs when they're in the reorganization or alpha phase. As shown in the diagram to the right, the reorganization phase has medium to high potential or access to resources, relatively low connectedness, so agility is maintained, and high resilience, or the ability to absorb shocks. What does this mean for an engineering education ecosystem? If innovation is desired, and I am increasingly convinced that at some level it isn't, then we should create many small efforts that have enough resources to do interesting things. These need to occur at microscales of the ecosystem and heavily involve students. Don't worry about connecting these efforts early on. Let them work in small groups. Relinquish control. Help them be resilient to thrive in times of uncertainty. In this case, resilience is safety, protection from the consequences of poor grades, or the tenure process. From complexity theory, emergence requires feedback among neighboring agents, which is the ability to communicate and to cluster, letting like find like. Enabling such emergence is not something that necessarily requires a program or initiative. Rather, from the ecosystem perspective, it involves changing the environment and allowing new structures to emerge. I believe this is possible since actually a relatively small fraction of undergraduate students' waking hours are spent in formal learning environments. Most of their time is in informal environments, which often we don't pay enough attention to and which would allow more possibilities for this emergence. Now, it turns out there have actually been some case studies that support these ideas. Chambliss and Takak's book, How College Works, followed a cluster of nearly 100 students over a span of 8 years at a liberal arts college in New York. What they found was that students face sequential challenges they must continuously adapt to, that the students thrive by making a small number of strong connections and a larger number of weak connections, that making opportunities visible was important, the structure matters in steering students' behavior, that students operate in an uncertain environment in which they have to make decisions, and supporting these decisions is critical, and that belonging and identities are not panaceas. They can be helpful or harmful. All of this aligns with ecosystem metaphors. Thriving requires nurturing environments which allows flow, pushing people together in common spaces and allowing them to experiment with activities, for example. These are the properties that enable emergence or allowing students to develop new worlds. While these results fit well with the ecosystem metaphor, at least at the scale of a university, what works at larger or smaller scales might be different. The book has actionable suggestions. Some of what they found to work are listed on the slide. They also found things that did not work to support student thriving. These included trying to control behaviors, which aligns with the view of students inhabiting different worlds. Also, investing too much in facilities was not helpful because facilities are places to connect and not substitutes for connection. Finally, and this may be a shock for some in engineering education, it was not effective to put too many resources into new pedagogies because they don't work for everyone, and students actually spend relatively little time in formal learning environments, as we just saw. Now, this slide is copied right out of How College Works, and it shows how the social network of student organizations clustered in this study. In terms of the finding that belonging and identity can either help or hurt students, it came down to how connected the activities in groups that students were engaged with were to other groups. For example, we have central activities in which students thrived and peripheral activities in which students tended not to. Those groups on the periphery that were more isolated and not as nested tended not to do as well. There are important lessons and cautions here. You have to recognize that emergence is not controllable. Experiments will fail, and the results may not be what we want or even be harmful. This is why dialogue and conversation and the development of shared health metrics of an ecosystem are important. Monitoring of an ecosystem is also important, and it's why larger scales need to be connected to smaller scales to provide stability and guidance. But too much oversight is stifling. We cannot have scale and homogeneity and also diversity and innovation at the same time. We have to embrace risk and not be too adverse to failure. The ecosystem perspective is clear that we cannot control engineering education as we would a machine. The fifth and last heuristic I want to talk about is to become a good navigator and learn to tell stories. This heuristic gives guidance on how to work within a complex ecosystem. If we think about preparing students to thrive in a boundless, all-encompassing ecosystem, what are we to do? The pipeline metaphor, based on ideas of a simple system, provides a clear map to a degree, the curriculum. Follow the map and you'll arrive at your destination. The key question is, how well do our maps align with the current landscape? In other words, how often are our maps updated? Do you even know the last time your curriculum had a major overhaul? This is a key question because if simple models like a pipeline actually fit the lived reality of the engineering ecosystem, then our work is done. But from many reports from industry councils, think tanks, foundations, and national panels, we hear that there is a misalignment, as well as what we might do to fix that misalignment. I want to acknowledge that while there is a neoliberal agenda that lurks under many of these reports, what they present is likely accurate. So from the pipeline metaphor, what we need to do is respond, as always, by fixing leaks and shifting the direction of the pipeline. From the pathways metaphor, we must build new pathways leading to the new endpoints that are emerging. But from the ecosystem metaphor, we must provide a capacity for those within the ecosystem to adapt and to thrive. I went to the web and I downloaded a curriculum chart, which you'll see on the left. Which one doesn't matter since we all have something that likely looks similar. This is a map we give students that has an inherent promise. Successfully navigate these courses and you will be prepared to be, insert job description here. However, as we have seen in complex adaptive systems or ecosystems, maps can be very complex and the system itself is dynamic. It changes with time. So on the right is a system map of the global food system that I grabbed from the web. You won't be able to read it, which is sort of the point. It's hard to map ecosystems in their full complexity. What is important to realize is that navigation by a map is a technological and Western solution. It likely does not apply in complex domains where other methods are needed. There have been cultures, for example Pacific Islanders, who have refined the art of navigation without maps using a technique called dead reckoning. This is a picture of Puluwat Atoll, where one of the remaining cultures of dead reckoning navigators exists. This is described in the book East is a Big Bird by Gladwin. Here, navigation is a culture that has high status on the islands. Within this culture, there are different schools, and each teaches a different form of navigation. And if you want to be a navigator, you apprentice yourself to one of these schools. In brief, dead reckoning, or getting yourself to a destination without the use of compasses or maps, relies on 3 heuristics. The first is steer by the shape of the sky, which is the ability to see the whole. It involves sensing one's place through the local wildlife, the color of the ocean, the sound and rhythm of waves, and other factors. To see the whole, it is important to develop multiple ways of sensing. The second heuristic is dynamic instability. The canoes that are used in navigation are designed for dynamic instability, so the navigator must constantly be interacting with their boat. There is no autopilot or set and forget, which is what is valued in Western boat design. The third heuristic is people take up a Ptolemaic rather than a Copernican view. In other words, rather than moving across the face of a fixed map, you're always at the center of the map, which moves by you. Or as Buckaroo Banzai put it, wherever you go, there you are. This puts the navigator in a position to sense an unfolding panorama, rather than feeling as if they must push toward a destination. Each of these heuristics is quite different than navigation by a map, where you plot a course, use measures of some type to ensure you adhere to that course, design your craft to be as stable as possible so it doesn't drift from the pre-planned course, and always see yourself moving across the face of the map toward a fixed destination. The Western way is not a bad method of navigating, but in a complex ecosystem, particularly one that's changing, and where one's destination is uncertain, as it is for many students, it may not serve as well as trying to see the changing whole, dynamically adjusting your course constantly, and seeing yourself at the center of your journey. After all, you don't need a map if you don't know where you're going. Much of our uncertainty and that of our students is that in a world where engineering skills are in increasing demand, we no longer know where our students are going. Now, in engineering education, we often talk about the need to develop both technical knowledge and professional skills, and spend a lot of time debating what the balance should be. The need for both was explained to me once by Diane Chong from Boeing. If a student has both skills, hire them. If they lack both, don't hire them. If they have professional but not technical skills, they will lack respect in the organization and not succeed. If they have technical but not professional skills, they're not going to develop into who they could be, and they won't stay in the organization because they won't advance. I want to argue that in the ecosystem framework, we need to think about a third set of skills, and those are navigational skills that will let students navigate the opportunities we create by supporting emergence, connection, and flow. Looking to the heuristics for navigation above will help, but as part of navigation, it's also necessary to comprehend the ecosystem, because unlike natural ecosystems where existence is sufficient, education should advance people in directions that are beneficial to them and will help them to thrive. Now, understanding complex system occurs between the system and the observer. There's a mutualness there. There are theories that posit the complexity of a system is actually relative to the knowledge of the observer and their ability to draw out or make sense of the relationships that define the complex system. This idea is expressed in Holling's Panarchy by the phrase, "If you cannot explain or describe the issue of concern using at least a handful of causes, then your understanding is too simple. If you require many more than a handful of causes, then your understanding is unnecessarily complex." But all our understanding is not rational. The psychologist Jerome Bruner viewed two types of understanding: rational or logico-scientific, as well as narrative. In contrasting the two modes of thought, Bruner argues that the narrative mode helps us make sense of experience. It turns out stories are important to human existence. Stories serve an evolutionary purpose. Cognitive play is a rehearsal for adult life. Stories let us have mental practice in a low-stakes environment for when the stakes are high. Stories serve as social glue. And stories enforce moral and ethical behavior without the need for a lot of structure. Narrative allows us to make sense of fragmented experience, and filling in by narrative happens whether we want it to or not. We are always going to create meaning through stories. To be able to work within an engineering education system, we must work on developing new understanding, narrative understandings, and this is why we need our colleagues in the social sciences and humanities, because we've created a world so complex that it cannot be understood without being able to tell stories. Narrative modes of understanding are likely more useful than rational modes for the understanding of perception needed for living in complex systems for several reasons. First, unlike a simple linear system, in a complex system, as we work within it, there's the possibility of changing the system. Navigation requires interpretation of our role as a character in an unfolding story. The current properties of complex systems depend on their history. So we must understand not just how they are, but how they came to be, or what the plot of the unfolding story is, and narrative helps us with this. Narratives also automatically imply a relationship, first person, third person, with, rather than independent from, a system. Perhaps more importantly, relationships imply some responsibility for the state of the larger system. Now in the pipeline model, there's an implication of one destination, but an ecosystem model, since position or state, I kind of like a good word for this, depends on relationships, the possibilities are infinitely larger. In this case, the agent must create their own meanings and relevance, and the narrative mode of understanding is how we create personal meanings. In brief, to summarize, in an ecosystem metaphor, the ability to see possibilities and navigate the system become critical skills, and these depend on developing narrative as well as rational or logico-scientific understanding. This is why engineering needs the social sciences and humanities. Now, there are many, many more heuristics that could be derived. For example, keep up with the expanding boundary, indicating that the boundary of technical social systems keeps expanding, and we must exert the effort to keep up with them and stay grounded. You could call this the Casey-Kasem rule. Embrace tensions between worldviews, which comes from Joy Ito's book Whiplash, emphasizing that changing your worldview is needed to embrace change. Another is have conversations about ecosystem health, which I've talked about before, and reminds us about the need to understand what health of an ecosystem really means before we start building programs, or that your niche limits your perspective. In order to grow, you need to move. Now, given that we all inhabit niches in the system that limit our perspectives, in order to break out of the traps we set for ourselves, we must shift our positions in the ecosystem occasionally. But I want to wrap up by summarizing again some of the main points and possible meanings. So here are some parting thoughts. I started off by making the case for the Telfy division that real technological and engineering literacy are issues of social justice. For example, when I was doing a project looking at makerspaces, I interviewed the manager of a space in a less economically thriving area of the District of Columbia that was focused on making a social justice. One of the quotes that I remember from this person who ran the space is that skills you can't take home aren't really skills. You can learn something, but unless you take it home with you and you have the technology to apply it, you haven't really gained anything. Technological and engineering literacy are not content areas or disciplines. They actually serve as a way to improve the life of families for many people. I also made the point that philosophy is important because our world is shaped by our beliefs and our perspectives, which are developed iteratively over our lives. The talk then looked at the pipeline and pathways metaphors and used the Cynefin framework to classify them as simple and complicated models of engineering education. A model is more than a tool, since it becomes a way both of seeing and changing the worlds. Models influence structure, and structure affects behavior. Models are neither value neutral nor person neutral. Like the wand choosing the wizard in Harry Potter, we tend to adopt models that align with our expertise. The talk then did a deeper dive into the ecosystem perspective, which draws from complexity theory, systems thinking, and living systems. The ecosystem model is nascent, itself emerging, and must evolve to become useful, but the model has several features. It is relational rather than object or process oriented. Lakoff and Johnson show that metaphors in our language usually situate us towards objects moving places, which is inherent in the pipeline and pathway models, but don't capture the relational nature of ecosystems. Also, ecosystems derive from coupling of an organism's structure to its environment, highlighting the role the environment plays in thriving. Ecosystems can sustain multiple worlds or ways of interacting with the environment. The idea of worlds can include existing studies that give insights into differentials of academic thriving. Relationships are mediated by structural coupling, highlighting the role that structure plays. I also emphasized ecosystem homeostasis and autopoiesis mean that established ecosystems resist change. A living system can't be tinkered the way that a machine can be. And ecosystems are subject to rare but rapid changes or punctuated equilibrium, which occur across ranges of scale. Processes of conservation and innovation are able to coexist. The talk then started to wrap up by defining some heuristics that guide thinking about ecosystems. These need considerable work, but highlight the fact that in the ecosystem metaphor, the idea of fixed rules or positivist theories aren't applicable. I want to make the case that ecosystem models, despite their complexity in a relatively early stage of development, may be important for the future of engineering education. One of the ideas often used in complexity theory is that of a landscape. A system can exist in multiple places in the landscape, which is essentially a map of possible system states. On smooth landscapes like the one shown in this slide, it's easy to navigate to a desired state, say a college degree shown by the red circle. In a rugged landscape, however, the task becomes more difficult. Now, historically, higher education has been a relatively smooth landscape. The destination for most students has been in sight. Achieving that destination provides known rewards, and maps exist to guide the journey. This journey, across this landscape, looks rather pleasant. But there are lots of environmental effects that are acting as forces and beginning to change that landscape from smooth to rugged. This, as James G. has pointed out, has the potential to create a tiered education system where those with resources can be guided to a great education while those without resources have more and more trouble piecing a worthwhile education together. This was the underlying concern of the Pathways report. If we're to both change and progress, then we must begin to look not just at improving how students learn, but the structures and environments that determine learning outcomes. The next point to make is about communication. Dialogue is going to be critical if we're to adopt models that don't have implicit actions or goals, such as fix leaks, and get to the end of the pipeline. There are many ideas that have been floated here that need to be expanded upon. The need to define ecosystem health, explorations into metrics, adapting ideas from biological into educational and social settings. Right now, we don't have ways or forums for this type of communication. I want to make a shameless pitch for a new journal, Murmuration, shown here, that seeks to provide new perspectives on educational systems by accepting work that JEE or AEE won't. We need to communicate not just among ourselves, but with all those in the ecosystem, most importantly our students, since it is there that innovations will likely emerge. I thought about how to present this idea and actually settled on a clip from Game of Thrones, because I'm a huge fan.
We represent all the great houses, but whoever we choose, they won't just rule over lords and ladies. Maybe the decision about what's best for everyone should be left to everyone. Maybe we should give the dogs a vote as well. Oh, it's my horse!
I selected this clip because it in essence captures the moral imperative of an ecosystem framework. To support coupling, emergence, and evolution from all stakeholders in the ecosystem, you have to both ask for and enable full participation. This model has the potential to radically change power relationships, which is why it is very unsettling for some faculty and administrators. However, there have been numerous experiments about bringing students more closely into the process of determining outcomes, and despite the fact it is not often done in engineering, the results have been encouraging. At the end of the day, it is important to remember that a student's engineering education is likely the only higher education they will get. Our philosophies must extend beyond engineering and encompass our students becoming persons. Or to begin to close the circle on this talk, as John McMurray, the philosopher I've been reading into lately, clearly states in this quote on the slide, education is personal, not technical. In other words, our philosophies matter. If we want to become as efficient as machines, then we build our education from machine metaphors. If we want to get students from point A to point B, then we should build our education system from pathway metaphors. But if we want to live, then maybe, just maybe, we should build our education system from metaphors drawn from living systems. I lack the words to summarize this conversation, to conclude simply what has been a very complex topic. It's not clear in my own head yet. I've tried to briefly capture the essence of what an ecosystem metaphor is, to me, at a personal and emotional level. In order to do this, I need to borrow the words of someone else that I think captures the essence of the ecosystem view perfectly, something I was not able to do. That person is the American novelist and activist James Baldwin. For nothing is fixed, forever and forever and forever. It is not fixed. The earth is always shifting. The light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock. Generations do not cease to be born, and we are responsible to them because we are the only witnesses they have. The sea rises, the light fails, lovers cling to each other, and children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out. Thank you.